The town that changed started slow, like a bad dream creeping in. People began acting odd. Little things at first: a neighbor yelling at shadows, a shopkeeper charging crazy prices. But soon it got worse. The once friendly faces turned hard and cold. Some folks started disappearing, leaving empty houses with doors wide open. Whispers of strange happenings filled the air. People talking to themselves, walking around naked, or acting like wild animals. Then came the night the lights went out. Not just a blackout, but a creepy kind of dark. A darkness that seemed to seep into your bones. When the power flickered back on, the town was changed. People's eyes glowed an eerie green. Their voices were like broken glass, and they moved with a jerky, unnatural speed. They started hunting in packs, their howls echoing through the night. No one was safe. The strong hid, the weak were taken. The town became a place of terror, where the only sound was the scream of the hunted and the savage growl of the hunters. It was like a nightmare you couldn't wake up from. A nightmare where your neighbors were the monsters. John was one of the lucky ones. He'd boarded up his house, stocked up on food and water. But even inside, the fear was a hungry beast. Every creak of the old house sounded like footsteps, every shadow a monster. Days turned into a blur of endless waiting. He'd peek out the cracks, watch the horrifying scene unfold. Neighbors he knew turned into snarling shadows, moving with unnatural speed and strength. Children, once full of laughter, now ran with wild eyes, their voices lost in inhuman howls. Then came the night they found him. Desperate howls echoed outside, flashes of light like angry eyes. John knew he couldn't hide forever. Cornered, alone, with nothing but a rusty old hammer, he faced the nightmare he'd been dreading. The door burst open. Two figures, tall and gaunt, eyes glowing, rushed in. John swung the hammer, a desperate gamble. Connected, but it didn't stop them. They were too fast, too strong. As darkness claimed him, John wondered if this was the end, or just the start of something even worse. A world overrun by shadows, where the only sound was the endless scream of fear. John's world went black. Pain exploded in his head. When his vision cleared, he was on the floor, the creatures gone. A strange calm washed over him. He looked at his hands. No wounds. He stood up, shaky but alive. Outside, the howls had stopped. The town was silent, eerily still. Cautiously, he stepped out of his house. The world was changed. Where once stood houses, there were only ruins. The air held a strange sweetness, like decay and something else, something unfamiliar. As days turned into weeks, John explored the ruins. He found no survivors, only signs of a terrible struggle. But amidst the desolation, he found something else. Plants were growing at an unnatural speed, lush and vibrant. And the animals, they were different, their eyes holding a strange intelligence. Then he saw them. Children, grown abnormally large, with pale skin and eyes that glowed faintly in the twilight. They moved with a grace that was both human and alien. They looked at him without fear, their eyes filled with a curiosity that chilled him to the bone. John realized then that this wasn't just a story of madness and destruction. It was a transformation. Something had changed the town, the people, everything, and he was the only human left. A survivor in a world that was no longer his. John became a hunter, not of prey, but of answers. He explored the ruins, searching for clues, any sign of what had happened. He found strange symbols carved into walls, and remnants of strange machines that looked like they came from another world. Nights were the worst. The woods, once familiar, were now a labyrinth of shadows and eerie whispers. Creatures with glowing eyes watched him, their forms shifting in the moonlight. He learned to survive, to fight, to kill when needed. One night, under a sky painted with eerie green lights, he stumbled upon a hidden underground chamber. Inside, a vast network of tubes and strange symbols covered the walls. At the center, a pulsing, crystalline object hummed with an otherworldly energy. As he reached out to touch it, the ground shook. The chamber began to fill with a thick, green mist. A voice, deep and echoing, spoke in his mind. "You are not alone, John. We watch." Then, darkness. When he woke, he was back in the ruins, the chamber gone. But something had changed within him. He felt a connection to the world around him, a sense of belonging that was both terrifying and exhilarating. He was no longer just a survivor. He was something else entirely, a witness to a new world order, a world where humans were an afterthought. And as he looked out at the transformed landscape, he realized a chilling truth. This was just the beginning. The quiet farm. The old Carter farm was a place people avoided. It stood at the end of a long, winding dirt road, surrounded by woods so thick, sunlight barely touched the ground. The Carters had lived there for generations, but one winter, they vanished without a trace. Locals whispered about strange lights and eerie sounds coming from the farm. Some even claimed to see shadowy figures moving around the old house. Fear kept people away, but curiosity was a stubborn thing. One brave or foolish young man named Jake decided to explore the farm. Armed with a flashlight and a healthy dose of bravado, he stepped onto the creaking porch. Inside, the house was dark and filled with an unsettling silence. Dust lay thick on everything, and cobwebs draped from the ceiling like ghostly veils. As he ventured deeper, the air grew colder, and an unseen presence seemed to watch his every move. Strange noises echoed through the house, scurrying sounds that made his skin crawl. Then he heard something else, a soft whimper. Following the sound, Jake found himself in the basement. It was pitch black, and the air was thick with the smell of decay. His flashlight beam cut through the darkness, revealing a horrifying sight. Hundreds of eyes glowed in the blackness. Not human eyes, but those of animals. Rats, snakes, and other creatures, large and small, were packed together in a dense, writhing mass. And in the center, a monstrous figure emerged. It was a woman, her skin pale and gaunt, her eyes hollow. But what truly terrified Jake were the animals that covered her body. Rats, snakes, and insects crawled over her like a living, breathing coat. She let out a blood-curdling scream, and the creatures erupted into a frenzy. Jake turned and ran, the horde of animals hot on his heels. He burst out of the house and into the night, the creatures still in pursuit. As he ran, he could hear their chittering, their hissing, getting louder and closer. And as he looked back one last time, he saw the monstrous woman standing in the doorway, her eyes burning with a hatred that chilled him to the bone. Jake burst from the Carter house. The cacophony of animal sounds a nightmare symphony behind him. His heart pounded like a drum, his breath coming in ragged gasps. The woods, once comforting, now seemed a menacing labyrinth. He stumbled and fell, his flashlight skittering away into the darkness. Panic seized him as the sounds grew louder. Something large crashed through the undergrowth, a monstrous shape silhouetted by the moon. Fear gave way to primal terror as it closed in. With a desperate lunge, Jake scrambled to his feet and ran blindly. Branches whipped at his face, roots tripped him, but he kept going. The creature's howls and snarls were a constant, terrifying rhythm. He tripped again, hard. Pain shot through his ankle, but he couldn't stop. As he lay there, gasping for air, he saw the creature emerging from the trees. Its shape was inhuman, a grotesque amalgamation of animal features. Its eyes burned with a cold, predatory intelligence. Just as it lunged, a gunshot echoed through the woods. The creature froze, then vanished into the darkness. A figure emerged from the shadows, a tall, shadowy man with a rifle in his hands. "You okay, kid?" the man asked, his voice low and gruff. Jake nodded, unable to speak. "Come on," the man said, helping him up. "We need to get out of here." As they walked away from the Carter farm, Jake looked back. The old house stood silent and dark, but he knew the horror within had not ended. It was just waiting, patient and deadly, for its next victim. The man's name was Silas, a grizzled old-timer with eyes that held the weight of countless silent nights. He lived on the edge of town, a hermit who knew more about the woods than anyone. His rescue of Jake was no accident. That place, Silas began, his voice low, is a sickness, Something wrong happened there. Something dark. He spoke of the Carters, of their obsession with their animals, of strange experiments and whispered rumors. Days turned into weeks. Jake, haunted by what he'd seen, couldn't shake the feeling he was being watched. The woods around the Carter farm seemed to hum with a sinister energy. Then strange things began to happen. Animals started acting odd. Dogs barked at empty air. Cats hissed at unseen threats. One night, as a blood-red moon hung low, Jake was awakened by a terrifying sound. It was a chorus of animal screams, a cacophony of terror that froze his blood. He grabbed his rifle and crept towards the Carter farm, his heart pounding in his chest. The farm was ablaze, an inferno against the night sky. As he drew closer, he heard a new sound, a guttural, inhuman roar. The woods erupted as creatures, monstrous and deformed, poured out of the burning farm. They were a grotesque patchwork of animals, their eyes burning with a feral madness. Jake fought, his rifle spitting fire, but they were too many, too fast. As he was overwhelmed, he saw Silas, standing tall amidst the chaos, his eyes filled with a cold determination. In his hands was a strange, ancient-looking weapon, a cross between a rifle and a torch. With a final, desperate shot, Jake fell, the world fading to black. As consciousness slipped away, he heard Silas' voice, a promise against the growing darkness. "It ends tonight, boy. It ends tonight." The house on Hemlock Hill. The old Blackwood house stood at the crest of Hemlock Hill, a shadow against the twilight sky. Locals whispered of strange happenings there, shadows moving on their own, eerie whispers in the night. Some even claimed to have seen ghostly figures in the windows. Ignoring the rumors, a young couple, Sarah and Ben, bought the house. They were drawn to its gothic charm, dismissing the local tales as old wives' tales. But as they settled in, strange things began to happen. Doors creaked open by themselves. Objects moved from one room to another. At night, they heard footsteps pacing above their heads, though the house was empty. Eerie whispers echoed through the walls, words they couldn't understand. Then the shadows started to change. They took on grotesque shapes, writhing and twisting in the corners of their vision. Shadows of eyes watched them from the darkness, cold and menacing. One night, Sarah woke with a start. The room was pitch black, but she knew someone or something was there. A cold dread crept over her as she felt a presence at the foot of the bed. It was tall, dark, and inhuman. Then, she heard it, a whisper, right in her ear. "You are not alone." Terror seized her as she tried to scream, but no sound came out. A cold hand touched her face, and she felt an icy chill seep into her bones. When she opened her eyes, the room was bathed in a sickly green light, and the figure was gone. From that night on, the house was a living nightmare. Shadows became their constant companions, their whispers a haunting melody. The line between sanity and madness blurred. And as the days turned into nights, Sarah and Ben realized they were not alone in the Blackwood house. Something evil lived within its walls, and it was hungry. The keeper's lament. The lighthouse stood as a sentinel against the relentless sea, its white form stark against the often stormy sky. It was a lonely place, they said, a place where sanity frayed at the edges. But to Elias, it was a refuge, a chance to escape the noise of the world. He'd been a lighthouse keeper for a year now. The first few months were filled with a strange exhilaration. The rhythm of the days was simple. Tend the light, watch the sea, and let the world shrink to the size of the horizon. But as the seasons changed, so too did something within him. A creeping unease, a sense of being watched, began to gnaw at his peace. It started with the whispers, soft, almost inaudible at first. They seemed to come from the depths of the lighthouse itself. They were like mournful sighs, carried on the wind but originating from somewhere within the stone walls. Elias dismissed them as the house settling, or perhaps the creaking of the old wood in the changing weather. Then came the shadows. They moved, danced in the corners of his vision, elongated and grotesque when the oil lamp cast its flickering glow. At first, he blamed the strain of endless hours alone, the tricks his mind played on him in the isolation. But as days turned into weeks, the shadows grew bolder, more defined. They took shapes, monstrous and inhuman, that chilled him to the bone. One night, a storm raged outside. The wind howled like a wounded beast, and the waves crashed against the lighthouse with a fury that shook the very foundation. Fear, cold and sharp, gripped Elias as he climbed the winding stairs to the lantern room. The wind buffeted him, and the old lighthouse groaned and creaked in protest. As he reached the top, the storm seemed to reach a crescendo. Lightning flashed, illuminating the churning sea below, and there, at the edge of the glass, a face appeared. A face not of human, but of something ancient, something evil. Its eyes, black and empty, seemed to pierce through the glass, into his soul. Terror seized him. He stumbled backward, heart pounding like a drum. The face vanished as quickly as it had appeared, but the darkness that followed was more terrifying. A cold hand seemed to grip his heart, and a voice, a whisper carried on the wind, echoed in his mind. "You are not alone." From that night on, the lighthouse was a different place. The whispers grew louder, more insistent. The shadows thickened, taking on horrifying forms that danced and twisted in the corners of his vision. Sleep became a luxury denied, as nightmares replaced dreams. Then came the scratching. It started softly, like a mouse scurrying behind the walls. But gradually, it grew louder, more insistent, a relentless assault on his sanity. He searched every corner of the lighthouse, but found nothing. Yet the scratching persisted, a maddening rhythm that drove him to the brink of despair. One morning, as he was preparing breakfast, he heard a new sound, a wet, sloshing noise coming from the basement. Fear propelled him downstairs. The air was thick with the smell of decay, and there, in the dim light, he saw it. A dark, oily substance was spreading across the floor, and from it emerged a shape, a grotesque, humanoid creature with webbed hands and glowing red eyes. It moved towards him with a speed that defied its grotesque form. Terror consumed him as he stumbled backward, his mind racing. He grabbed a heavy iron bar and swung it with all his might. The creature howled in pain, but it did not stop. A desperate struggle ensued, a battle between man and monster in the heart of the storm-battered lighthouse. The creature was stronger than he'd imagined, its claws raking at his flesh. But Elias fought with a ferocity born of despair. Finally, with a Herculean effort, he managed to land a blow that sent the creature crashing to the ground. It lay still, a dark, oily puddle spreading around its grotesque form. Exhausted and terrified, Elias collapsed to the floor. When he woke, the creature was gone. The basement was clean, the air fresh, but the fear remained. He knew it was not over. The lighthouse was haunted, and he was its prisoner. Days turned into weeks, and the horrors continued. The whispers, the shadows, the scratching, they were constant companions. And then there were the visions, the glimpses into a dark, twisted reality that existed beyond the walls of the lighthouse. He saw things that made his blood run cold, things that defied explanation. He saw the sea rise up, swallowing the lighthouse whole, and heard the screams of drowning sailors. He saw creatures of nightmare emerging from the depths, their eyes burning with an unholy light. One night, as a particularly violent storm raged outside, the lighthouse seemed to tremble. The walls groaned and cracked, and the old building swayed precariously. Elias knew then that the end was near. He climbed to the lantern room one last time. The wind howled around him, and the rain lashed against the glass. Below, the sea churned and frothed, a monstrous beast eager to claim its prey. As he stood there watching the storm, he felt a sense of peace, an acceptance of his fate. He had lived through hell, and now it was time to face the final curtain. With a heavy heart, he extinguished the light. The darkness enveloped him, and as the last vestiges of his sanity faded, he heard a voice, a whisper carried on the wind, "Welcome home." And then, there was nothing. The lighthouse stood alone, its secret buried deep within its ancient stones. The sea continued to crash against its base, a mournful dirge for the keeper who had lost his soul to the darkness. And in the depths of the ocean, something stirred, something ancient and evil, waiting for the next unsuspecting soul to venture into its domain. The lighthouse was a graveyard of hope, a tomb for the living. And so, the legend grew, a chilling tale whispered in the darkness, a warning to those who dared to challenge the sea. For in the heart of the storm, where land and water meet, there lurks a darkness that consumes all who dare to look into its abyss. Decades later, the lighthouse stood as a skeletal reminder of the sea's relentless power. Its windows were dark, empty eyes staring out at the indifferent ocean. Local folklore painted it as a haunted place, a place where the living dared not tread. Yet, when the government announced a new keeper for the lighthouse, a young, ambitious woman named Anya, there was a ripple of disbelief and fear through the coastal town. Anya was different, unafraid of the sea, unfazed by isolation. She was driven by a thirst for adventure and a strange fascination with the unknown. The lighthouse, with its aura of mystery, was the perfect challenge. Her first night was marked by a storm as fierce as any the old-timers could remember. The lighthouse groaned and creaked under the onslaught, and the sea roared like a wounded beast. Anya, armed with a flashlight and a stubborn spirit, climbed the winding stairs to the lantern room. The wind howled, a banshee's wail that seemed to penetrate her very soul. Lightning cracked across the sky, illuminating the churning sea below. And then she saw it, a shape, dark and monstrous, emerging from the waves. It was a creature of legend, a sea serpent, its massive body undulating with a terrifying grace. Fear, cold and sharp, seized her. It was as if the lighthouse itself was trembling, as if it knew what was coming. The creature's eyes, glowing an eerie green, seemed to lock onto her. A primal terror surged through her, a fear that was older than humanity itself. She stumbled backward, the wind whipping at her hair. The creature reared its head, its gaping maw filled with rows of razor-sharp teeth. Anya felt a cold dread seep into her bones. This was no figment of imagination, no trick of the mind. It was real and it wanted her. With a desperate effort, she turned and fled, the creature's bellow echoing in her ears. The descent down the winding stairs seemed to take an eternity. Every creak and groan of the lighthouse amplified her fear. When she finally reached the ground floor, she collapsed, her body trembling uncontrollably. The storm raged on, a symphony of destruction. Anya huddled in a corner, her mind racing. She had seen the impossible, a creature from the depths, a relic of a time when myths were reality. The lighthouse was no ordinary building. It was a prison, a cage to contain something ancient and evil. Days turned into weeks. Anya learned to coexist with fear. The lighthouse became her world, a microcosm of isolation and terror. The whispers started again, soft at first, then growing louder, more insistent. They were filled with a haunting melody, a mournful dirge that seemed to seep into her soul. And then there were the shadows, the same grotesque shapes that had tormented the previous keeper. They danced and twisted in the corners of her vision, taking on horrifying forms. She tried to ignore them, to convince herself they were the product of a tired mind. But they were too real, too vivid. One night, while tending the light, she felt a cold touch on her arm. She whirled around, her heart pounding. Nothing was there. But then, she saw it in the reflection of the glass. A pair of glowing eyes, cold and empty, staring back at her. A scream tore from her throat. She stumbled backward, her mind racing. The creature was back, and this time it was inside the lighthouse. She grabbed a heavy iron bar and stood her ground, her heart pounding like a drum. The darkness seemed to thicken, and then it moved. A shape emerged from the shadows, a grotesque, humanoid creature with webbed hands and glowing red eyes. It was the same creature her predecessor had fought, but larger, more menacing. A battle ensued, a desperate struggle for survival. Anya fought with a ferocity born of terror. She swung the iron bar with all her might, but the creature was too quick, too strong. It closed in on her, its hot, fetid breath washing over her face.